Buonasera a tutti e bentrovati a questo webinar dell'Istituto Bruno Leoni. Faccio una brevissima introduzione in italiano per poi passare all'inglese, che sarà la nostra lingua di lavoro questa sera. Io sono Carlo Stagnaro, sono direttore delle ricerche dell'Istituto Bruno Leoni e l'obiettivo della discussione di questa sera è esprimere delle prime opinioni, dei primi pareri, delle prime valutazioni sul rapporto Draghi, che è probabilmente un documento o il documento che contiene una serie di proposte di riforma, revisione degli obiettivi e degli strumenti della politica economica europea che più condizionerà il dibattito nei prossimi mesi. Let me switch to English, and first of all, let me thank all of those who are following this webinar, and let me also say thanks to our speakers today, Daniel Gros from the Bocconi University, Daniele Lacaille from Tressis and IE Business School, and Nicola Rossi from the University of Roma, Vergata, and from Istituto Bruno Leoni. The goal of today is to start debating from a free market point of view, which is the perspective of Istituto Bruno Leoni, about the Draghi report, which is probably and presumably going to be a milestone in the debate about how and to what extent and towards which direction Europe's economic policy should change and should evolve. We have 1 hour to, as I said, start debating. We will organize further occasions to dig deeper and deeper in the report. So today's goal is, first of all, to focus on some issues and implications from the Draghi report. We asked three scholars, three intellectuals who have worked in the past few years on these same issues, which have to do with Europe's lack of competitiveness or Europe's lagging competitiveness as compared to other countries, such as the United States and China. And we want today to focus on three main issues: industrial policy, trade policy, and public finances. So I will start by giving the floor to our speakers, asking them to basically express in around 10 minutes each their point of view. I will start with Daniel Gros, to who is a very knowledgeable person about how Europe's policy making works, among other things. I will ask him to start discussing the industrial policy which is underlying the Draghi report and how Draghi suggests to change industrial policy, and whether you believe that this is the right way to address Europe's problems. So Daniel, you have the floor, and thank you very much again for being here.
And thank you very much to the Institute Bruno Leoni for inviting me. Let me start by saying that Draghi starts with the right diagnosis of the problem, but then ends up with the recommendations. He starts by saying that Europe lacks presence in the new sectors, in high-tech sectors. This is something that we have flagged also recently in our own work, which we call the middle technology trap. So European enterprises are mainly located in the middle technology section of industry. They feel comfortable there, and that's where they invest. And that's also where they make their main profits. Whereas in the US, a new sector or new sectors have evolved, especially the information technology sector, software, where new enterprises have emerged over the last 20 years who are now giants, and nothing of the similar sort has happened in Europe. Now, if that is the problem, then the question is, what is the solution? Draghi also says that outside the ICT sector, if you take the European economy outside the ICT sector, it actually has performed as well or as badly as that of the United States minus ICT. So the problem is clearly in one particular sector, which has not grown in our part of the world. Is that due to the lack of public spending? Is that due to the lack of support from government, from industrial policy? No, the ICT sector has evolved spontaneously on its own, bottom up in the United States, because there were the right conditions. You could easily create new enterprises, and the cost of trying were acceptable. In Europe, the cost of trying and failing is rather high, and that's of course why fewer people actually try, and why the return from trying is much lower, because the return from trying is 9 times failure, 1 time success. But if the cost of failure is high, then the cost of success is just not high enough to overcome the other part. What does Draghi then recommend? He recommends an industrial policy that should protect existing industries in the EU, in some cases from Chinese and other competition. Now, it is difficult to see how that would actually increase innovation in Europe. Draghi also says we should have a different way to support innovations in Europe. And it is clear that the government has to play a role in supporting pre-competitive research and development. That is all well taken, but that is, let's say, plays much or less of a role in this report than the other part, which is to support existing industries, in some cases to protect them against foreign competition, in some cases to guarantee our security. And I must say this security argument is very difficult to judge. It's being used, in my view, in too many cases, and therefore that lends itself to an industrial policy that in the end preserves the old structure, the mid-tech technology that we already have. And in that sense, the kind of industrial policy that Mario Draghi proposes, not 100%, let's say, but 80-90% of it would actually reinforce the middle technology trap and would not be useful to get Europe into these new sectors, which promise a much higher growth potential than the other ones. Let me stop here. I think this is my overall judgment on the industrial policy part of the Draghi report.
Thank you very much. I will just, pick up on the latest remark you made about the frequency of the word and of the argument of security as a reason for implementing new pervasive public policies. And I will switch to Daniel Lacaille, because security and to use another word which is quite frequently employed in the report, strategic autonomy or technological autonomy, are also often used by the Draghi report to argue that Europe is, let me put it more bluntly than the Draghi report does, too much open to trade, and that therefore we should pursue a growing degree of autonomy, at least in the strategic sectors, including high technologies and whatever you can label as a strategic sector, which as Italians, maybe we will discuss with Nicola later. We know that we can call strategic basically everything. So my questions to Daniel is, how do you see the trade-related proposals of the Draghi report and their implications? Do you believe that we are facing a trade-off between trade openness and the growth of competitiveness in Europe?
Well, thank you very much to start with for inviting me to this webinar and to the Institute Bruno Leoni. Let's start by picking up on what Professor Gros has just mentioned, which is that the Draghi report does a very good diagnosis. And then, like some sort of doctor that is basically, sorry, I just got like some sort of doctor that sees an alcoholic patient and diagnoses 5 more vodkas, makes the wrong assessment. And one of them is what you just mentioned, no? Draghi makes a completely wrong assessment of opening in terms of trade and at the same time defending the strategic sectors, no? Draghi, the Draghi report looks at the picture of where the United States is today and where China is today, and thinks that the reason why they're here is because of all of the barriers to trade, subsidies, enormous government spending and intervention, when those are actually the reasons why the United States is not growing at 3.5% as it should, or China is not growing at 5%, and the reasons why China has one of the largest real estate bubbles in history. No? So Draghi puts the idea of security in a way that makes it look like open trade is a threat. When we know that the best way to combat protectionism from other countries is actually to be more open. If a country wants to shoot itself in the foot with protectionist measures, they may shoot themselves in the foot. But you don't become better by making the same mistakes, no? So, to me, the biggest mistake there are a number of large mistakes of the Draghi report, but the number one is to identify incorrectly the reasons of the leadership of China and the United States. The technological leadership of China started by basically lifting intellectual property from the United States to the tune of around $225 billion a year, according to Congress. No? But actually rose and became a massive global leader when China started to promote and to defend the creation of wealth, when it started to remunerate wealth creation. The United States technological leadership has absolutely nothing to do with what Draghi mentions of security and defense. There is the investment in defense is a needed element in order to secure borders and for strategic reasons, but it's not enough to be a technological leader. You have to remunerate wealth and wealth creation. No, so I'm particularly concerned about Draghi's sort of defense of some kind of benign protectionism as a way to protect the European industries, when what has destroyed European industries has been precisely the chain of protectionist measures implemented by the European Union using the back door of environmental policies or strategic sort of let's say suggested acquisitions. Because that's another important thing, and I leave it here, is that Draghi fails to mention the most important thing about the lack of leadership in technology of the European sectors. 25 years ago, when I started working, the technology and telecommunication giants of the European Union were global leaders with unprecedented access to capital and undeniable power to become larger, bigger, and better. They willingly and explicitly decided not to invest in the technologies that are now driving the world and preferred to build so-called national champions via inorganic acquisitions. It's not that because they could have, actually. I remember when companies like Telecom Italia or Telefonica actually had the opportunity of purchasing some of the companies that today are $100 billion companies. They didn't. And they didn't because they had absolutely no vision. So elevating those companies with a group of politicians to make central plan decisions about industrial policy would be absolutely destructive for the European Union. And I was saying this actually this morning to a group of colleagues. Imagine for a second that in 2009, the European Union decided to follow what Draghi has proposed in his report. Today, the euro area would not be in stagnation. It would be in a depression.
Thank you very much. Let me finally switch to Nicola. Nicola's main focus is public finances, so I would ask you a comment on what has been probably the most widely commended proposal by Draghi, that is to start a massive cycle of investments in the strategic sectors or in the strategic technologies that would amount to 800 billion euro per year, about 5% of Europe's GDP, or slightly lower, less than 5% of Europe's GDP, including both private and public investments. But everybody understood that the missing part, as compared to today, is a substantial share of public investments, while financing this increased expenditure by issuing European debt. So let me ask you, Nicola, about a comment about this particular aspect of the report, but also a broader view of the report, also in the light of what Daniel and Daniel have just said. So, Nicola, you've got the floor.
Thank you, Carlo. Thank you to the Istituto Bruno Leoni. At the beginning of the summer, when Mario Draghi gave us anticipations about the content of the Draghi report, I dare to write that the report was addressed to the European institutions, but was not at all addressed to the Europeans. And yeah. I think I can maintain this judgment after having read the 400 pages of the report, which, by the way, is not easy reading sometimes. And in fact, I mean, the report seems to be written by the European Commission for the European Commission. That is, it is an entirely internal bureaucratic document. It lacks any understanding of what presently the European, the values, beliefs, the attitudes of the Europeans are, and the fact that Europeans tend to have sometimes very different views about the future of Europe and about the world they live in. So obviously you might say that the report was not supposed to do this, and I agree, but I found surprising that there was no single word in the report suggesting that if you want a competitive Europe, you must have Europeans convinced that Europe must be competitive. You must European convinced that market economy is a good thing. You must Europeans convinced that attitude to risk is a good thing, and so on. And this is not so in many countries in Europe, and obviously I look at Italy quite closely. Now, having said this, let me give an example of this before going to public finances. I found it very instructive the way the report looks at technology. If the report had been written, let's say, 10 years ago, I would be ready to bet that it wouldn't have any reference to artificial intelligence. And that's obvious. The reason is simple. I mean, bureaucrats talk about what they know, what is already there. An innovation policy is a policy about what is not there and yet. You don't know what is going to be innovation tomorrow. You want just to create, I think both Daniel Gros and Daniel Lacan said more or less the same thing. You want to create the environment that allows people to try and to create what you simply don't know that is not there yet. On the contrary, the Draghi report is almost, I would say entirely devoted to what is already known, to what is, in some sense, innovation of the past, and not what is innovation of the future, which we don't know. But I mean, we can elaborate on this more if you like. Let me just say a few words on the matter of the public debt, of the common European common public debt. Again, let's not talk about technicalities. Let's talk about the vision that is in the Draghi report. Once more, the idea behind the statements of the Draghi report on the European public debt is a simple one. Is the idea that member states should accept the idea of a common of sharing risks for a superior good that is the future of Europe. Now, this is interesting because sometimes we forget history. If one goes back to what is usually called the Hamilton moment in the United States, one finds out that the Hamilton moment was, in fact, the ability of James Hamilton of building a coalition of interest of people, actually of bondholders, that thought much safer having as a counterpart to the federal state and not the single state. It was not a matter of the issuer. James Hamilton did not convince the issuer that they had to give away their right to a bond issue and leave it to the federal state. It was a coalition of bondholders. Now, bondholders in the European case are, to a very large extent, the European Central Bank and the banking system. Again, I mean, this is quite clear in the Italian state, much less so elsewhere, but more or less, I think I'm not wrong. Building a coalition of bondholders, actually looking for a European common public debt, I think is very difficult in this condition. But if you don't look at this issue from this point of view, we just, it's just an intellectual vocation, nothing else. It's not something practical. In this respect, I mean, the view of the Draghi report is that it is very pragmatic. Let me say it is not.
Thank you, Nicola. Well, I think in this first round of opinions, a critical approach, to say the least, has emerged about the Draghi report. Let me play the devil's advocate, or the dragon's advocate. Draghi also proposes a substantial revision of many policies that have been discussed in the past few years, and particularly he emphasizes in various chapters of the second section of the report that over-regulation has put the brakes instead of accelerating Europe's ability to innovate, for example, in terms of higher energy costs or in terms of regulation preventing digital innovation to happen in Europe as much as it did in other jurisdictions. So do you think that these proposals, I mean, first of all, let me ask the same question to all of you. Do you agree with these specific proposals? And secondly, do you find them consistent with the broader view emerging from the report? Or do you believe that they are somehow at odds with the idea that Europe should somehow do more and centralize more than it has done so far. So I will follow the same cycle as earlier. So Daniel Gros, you have the floor.
There's very little to disagree with the general thought that regulation has increased the cost for business in Europe, but there's zero specificity to what actually should be eliminated. Does he want to roll back part of the Green Deal? I mean, just having a commissioner for simplification is useless. We already had previously a commissioner, a vice president of the commission, who was also tasked with simplification. So unless simplification is the most difficult thing to do, because every regulation we have is put in for a reason, because we think that knowing the supply chain is worth the costs. Now you can say, okay, we have later found out that the supply chain directive involves too high costs, but are you proposing to change it? Because that is not what he does. And I'm always saying, if you want to simplify, very good, give me concrete examples and their trade-offs. The key issue for Europe in many cases is what we call the precautionary principle. So something that could conceivably do harm is not allowed, not because we have made a cost-benefit calculation that actually the potential costs are higher than the potential benefits, but any potential harm should be forestalled. And as long as we do not abandon this principle, I think very little progress can be made in Europe on deregulation.
Thank you, Daniel. The other Daniel.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Just to add to what Professor Gros was saying, I think it's very important to understand the sort of disingenuous approach to the diagnosis that the Draghi report makes, because, you know, in a recent article, I was making a comparison, saying that the Draghi report was like the TV series Lost. I don't know if the people that are watching us have seen the TV series Lost, and you get very excited, and it's a long series, and it's very, very exciting. And then you get to the end, and it's the worst ending ever. Which goes to what you've just said. What you've just said is, yes, he absolutely says that over-regulation has penalized the development of the European Union, and that the level of over-regulation hinders the capacity to develop technology and also energy. However, the solution is even worse, no? Because he thinks that the problem of over-regulation comes from the what he calls the dissolution, no, of policies. Too many states meandering around, no? It needs a centralized sort of approach, central planning type of way. I come back to what I said before. If that had been the case in 2009, today the European Union would not be in stagnation, it would be in depression. Because the industrial, technological, and energy policy implemented in 2009 would have been precisely the opposite, that has at least allowed to navigate some of the challenges of the incorrect regulations and policies to address the urgencies of the future. Of the present, sorry. So my problem is that, first, in the recommendations, there is absolutely zero detail about what to reduce in terms of regulation, and certainly no message whatsoever about the reduction of taxes. There is absolutely no mention about the taxation reductions that are required. So he's basically just saying, well, there's way too much regulation, but I'm not going to say what to do about it. Furthermore, he is basically asking for regulation on top of regulation, no? And I come back to what Professor Rossi was mentioning, which I think is very important. Is a misdiagnosis of what leads to technological development. In the entire report, there is zero mention of the importance of creative destruction. what has led to the rise of giants like Tesla, like Amazon, like Alphabet, like Netflix, is also the story of the hundreds, thousands of companies that have failed and disappeared. So precisely his approach to a sort of national champion protectionism in a convoluted sort of corporate political centralized planning group actually looks for the opposite, looks to try to protect those zombie companies that have been zombified by the same regulation that allows them to breathe but not to get out of the water. So yes, the diagnosis is correct, but he does not give any type of, because it would have been very easy to say, and this is a plan for in the next 5 years for every new European side regulation that is implemented. We're going to eliminate this, and this local regulations, for example, or something like that. And it goes to the fact that he is the person that implemented the monster quantitative easing of 2014. I was at CNBC when that was launched, and we had the opportunity of talking with Mr. Draghi about it. And he was talking about the trillions of quantitative easing that were going to be implemented. And I asked him one question: what for? And I'm still waiting for the answer. It's the idea that size is what matters, is that the reason why China and the United States are better off is because of large scale projects. That's why he talks about this 800 billion a year investment, which, by the way, I am completely sure that came to 800 billion because saying a 1,000 billion, 1 trillion in Europe, 1 trillion, 1 European trillion would look too aggressive, which is the same reason why they went for 2 trillion of quantitative easing instead of 4.
Thank you. Nicola?
Carlo, when faced with the criticism of overregulation, many institutions simply react by saying, "Oh, yes, you're right, but if I could regulate the way I should regulate, things would be much better." And so they add regulation to the existing one. And this seems to be the case of the Draghi report. There's no attempt to assess the consequences of previous choices, which, for example, have a lot to do with the Draghi report. Let me just give you an example. We are now, a number of European countries are presently engaged in the application of the Next Generation EU program. Okay, what's the point in saying today that we should defer that plan in the future, while before having understood if that plan works? Just to give it, the basic ideas behind the Next Generation EU, that is reform and investment, are the basic ideas behind the Draghi report. If I can have a look at the Italian experience, especially the experience of the last 30 years, but if I can go back in time, also the experience, let's say, of the last decades of the 19th century. In the Italian case, the summing up, reforms and investment did never produce growth. There are a number of reasons for this, obviously. I'm not extending this conclusion to other European countries, but this is what happened. Now, assuming as a dogma that the combination of reforms and investment in any case produces growth is, I think, to say the least, not very prudent. And I would have expected to see what the results of the Next Generation EU actually are before suggesting something. Especially before suggesting, for example, common European common debt, which, in my view, might be a very good idea, but you have to convince people that it is a good idea. Otherwise, it's just, as I said, an intellectual vocation.
Thanks a lot, Nicola. Let me go back to Daniel Gros' first answer. A way to summarize what you said, or you will tell me if this is correct, is that in your view, Europe's problem number one does not lie in capital accumulation. It rather lies in capital allocation within Europe and within European firms. Wouldn't Draghi's proposals of increasing capital spending in Europe a way to change capital allocation by increasing its accumulation? I mean, in a way, one may argue that it's a politically effective way to tell people, okay, you don't have to give up whatever you're doing, you don't have to shut off unproductive firms, but by investing more and by directing private and public investments through, I mean, the European Union's regulation and spending, you would shift resources and capital towards the economic sectors and economic activities that explain most of the mismatch with the United States and China. Do you think that in this perspective, from this perspective, Draghi's report and Draghi's proposals might be a politically feasible way to changing capital allocation in Europe?
I leave the political feasibility to others. It doesn't make sense from an economic point of view. If the problem, as you already said, is capital allocation, then it doesn't make sense to say, okay, we let some enterprises continue to waste their capital and we put public money into the new sectors. How do you do that? How do you find these new sectors? I mean, this is just very strange. And also the way Mario Draghi wants to have more investment, he says in his report that there should be subsidies for investment and lower interest rates. If you give enterprises lower interest rates, they will invest more in low-risk projects. That's what already happened with the Juncker plan. So I think this more of investment doesn't make economic sense. By the way, Japan is doing exactly what Draghi proposes. The Japanese investment rate is at the level that Draghi proposes. And what we have seen in Japan is, since most of the investment goes on the middle tech sectors, like in Europe, Japan hasn't growing. That does not mean that some ideas, like the making the European capital markets more open, favoring more investment in risk capital, all that makes sense. But you cannot mix that up in one soup with saying, and by the way, we give incentives for investment and we spend a couple of $100 billion directly on it from the public sector. As I said, there's one part of Draghi which makes sense, more integration of markets, more equity investment, but all the rest, more and more this quantity stuff, that is counterproductive.
Thank you. Daniel, still on the political feasibility argument, do you think that Nicola mentioned the president of the Next Generation EU program and the National Resilience and Recovery Plans? The underlying idea back then in 2020 or 2021 was that by giving the European governments enough money to do useful investments, I mean, leave aside for a while what useful means, you could also buy the political consensus to implement otherwise impossible reforms. Do you think that this kind of reasoning could apply to the Draghi report?
It is hidden in the report a few times, this idea that the situation in Europe is so challenging that you need to find compromises, no? In America, they say that a shit sandwich does not get better by putting mustard or ketchup on it. No, it's still a shit sandwich. So the idea that you're going to give governments even more money than the Juncker plan or even more money than the next generation EU, and this will somehow work because there will be some trickle-down effect in which a few of those millions will go to really technology advancing or developing projects, makes absolutely zero sense, makes no sense whatsoever. The negative impact of misallocation of capital is so huge on the level of debt and the level of subsequent taxation and stagnation of the economy that you're basically drowning the ability to grow. And there's one thing that I find quite staggering about the Draghi report. No, Spotify was created in the European Union and it left. No, there's absolutely nothing in the report that says why we have the talent. No, we have the entrepreneurship and the ability. We just don't have the remuneration of wealth creation. And I remember saying this in the European Parliament, and a Dutch MP said to me, "It's not that we don't have a Mark Zuckerberg or an Elon Musk, is that we don't want it." And that is precisely what sums up why this political feasibility doesn't work. Number one, you say you're going to give a tremendous amount of money to governments in order to invest in sound projects in exchange for hard reforms. They don't implement the hard reforms and they squander the money anyhow. The example, very evident, is in Spain. No, it has actually implemented counter reforms and become even more over-regulated, even more intervene, and even more against business. So that doesn't work, and it doesn't work because it's the negation of the system that creates progress. Is that in order to have Amazon, you need to put Walmart at threat, which is something that the European Union will never accept. No, if you have I said in an article that when Amazon appeared, it was a tremendous threat to Walmart, the largest private employer in the United States. If that happened in the European Union, centrally or independently, nation by nation, would follow the following steps. Number one, subsidize Walmart. Number two, fiscally penalize Amazon. Number three, zombify both. So it's impossible. No, something does not come. You know, Chris Rock says that you cannot create diamonds hugging coal rocks. You need to squeeze. Without squeezing, you're not going to get diamonds. You cannot get diamonds from throwing money to zombie companies and throwing money to zombie governments and expecting that somehow out of that mess Google or an Amazon will come. The only way in which you get into Google or an Amazon is if you get the collapse of a WorldCom or an Enron. And that is something that the European Union is not just not willing to accept, is that it is blatantly against, as we saw with the policies of COVID-19 and as we have seen with the Next Generation EU fund, which instead of going to the high added value companies, the small businesses that could actually develop to be large technological giants in the future, has gone to the same zombie companies that decided not to invest in any of those things in the past, which and I come back to that point to finalize, is that the European Union doesn't have a problem because of lack of access to capital or because of lack of capital investment. It's actually the opposite. The European Union has a problem of over spending in the areas that, as Professor Rossi was saying, you get free money, you invest in allegedly safe investments, and those safe investments fail. We analyzed the entirety of the Juncker plan, and less than 5% of the investments have generated positive economic return. So free money doesn't work that way. There's only one way in which money creation works, which is the way in which it happened in the United States, is that the private sector, through the destruction, the creative destruction, and the reward of the successful, brings those giants. A lot of people say that these technological giants are the result of quantitative easing in the United States. Well, that may be a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition, because through quantitative easing, you don't get a Tesla. You get a Tesla through a quantitative easing and expansion of credit that goes to thousands of competitors of Tesla that disappear, and one rises to the top. The Draghi plan is the opposite, is throwing hundreds of billions to things that will continue to exist, therefore zombify, therefore cost in working capital, and therefore cost in higher debt, and therefore in higher taxes, in order to expect that at some point you can get a Cellnex in order to then destroy it, as the Spanish government did, in order to try to preserve Telefonica, continuing to be a zombie.
Thank you. To close the question round about political feasibility, in the latest chapter, I think it's the latest chapter of the second part of the Draghi report, Draghi proposes a significant reform of Europe's governance, particularly by moving to Brussels powers and competencies, including issuing debt and directing public spending, that today, by and large, belong with the member states. This has been a long-standing proposal in the European debate, and there were virtually a very large agreement on that, in the sense that everybody going on the newspapers were saying we need more Europe and not less Europe. But in the end of the day, they failed to move in that way. Do you think that Draghi's proposals are a way to, again, buy out that kind of institutional reform that Europe has been not able to pursue until now?
Difficult to say. Look, there are a number of suggestions which I think should be shared by everybody. I mean, especially if we go toward a new round of enlargement, I mean, do not discuss the idea of abolishing the veto is very strange. I mean, you cannot run a supranational entity with a veto power when there are 27 or 35 member states or whatever. So there are a number of things that are quite obvious. At the same point, let me put the things in a different way. The Draghi report would have been a totally understandable program if it had been commissioned by a European government originating from the European Parliament. That is, if in the last European election, European citizens could have voted for a parliament and then electing a government. This is not so. The problem is that this report is written for a commission which does not represent the ideas of this or that part of the European population. In this respect, this is the real problem, that there was never a debate in Europe involving the Europeans about what competitiveness is, about what a competitive society is, about all the things that I can subscribe entirely, said by Daniela Carl and so on. If this is lacking, it remains something very high in the sky. And my feeling is that if you look carefully, we notice that the Draghi report is still a matter of debate in the institution, for the institution, but it's not a popular debate. You don't go in the train from Rome to Milan and hear people talking about the Draghi report. You don't enter a bar and say people talking about the Draghi report. It's not a matter that the Europeans feel as their problem. And obviously this has to do with the way the European institutions are built, and with the fact that they are probably, as they are unable to provide anything. I'm sorry, I'm very sorry to say it, because I'm a European fan in all respects. But it seems to me that the real issue here is a political one, much more than an economic one.
Thank you. You have just a few minutes left, so let me close with a very quick question. Had Draghi called any of you to ask, or maybe he did, I don't know, to ask advice while writing this report, and had you to identify one single issue you think he should have focused on, which kind of advice would you have provided to Draghi? Daniel, and then Nicola.
As I said at the beginning, the key issue should be, and I think there Draghi agrees, that Europe has too little activity, too little new enterprises, too little investment in high tech, especially in the ICT sector. Europe does not do badly in some high-tech sectors, even aerospace and so on, but is absent from especially the software sector and business-to-consumer internet stuff. I would have said this is the area you should concentrate upon. This does not require lots of money by governments. It requires, as my colleagues have said as well, capital market that can provide risk capital, and it requires a legislative framework that allows enterprise also to fail and to close down. This is unfortunately something which is decided at the national level, labor markets, regulations and so on at the national level. But what you should say is that if you want the new to arise in Europe, we also have to let the old die. We are basically full employment, and unless we close some factories and liberate people to do new things, there will be no big new sectors arising. That would have been my simple message. And Carlo, if I apologize, I will have to leave very soon. But very many thanks for bringing us together.
Thank you very much, but we are closing. I mean, we had 1 hour and we decided to stick to the 1 hour time limit. So Daniel, should you have provided one single hint to Draghi that is not included in the report already? What would you have said?
What I would have done is to propose the administration highway, which is a system of simplification of all of the regulatory burdens and all of the transaction challenges that exist within the European Union through one single window. No, and obviously that takes time, but that would basically lead to a pathway of eliminating existing regulations at a certain pace, month by month, year by year, in order to sort of let the businesses breathe. Second, it would be a taxation policy. No? What Draghi fails to understand is that there are very high disincentives to wealth creation via the taxation. So, for example, it makes no sense to have capital gains tax the way that it is implemented. It makes no sense to have such elevated taxation to start up businesses that have not even generated revenues. So there's also a taxation impact, no? So I would have basically proposed streamlining of regulation through an administrative highway, and at the same time a taxation adjustment, a significant tax cut for the corporate side, which goes precisely against what all governments want to implement. But anyway, that is what I would have said.
Nicola?
Carlo, at all levels and everywhere in Europe, let people try, let people fail, let people succeed.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. That's the best ending I could have imagined. Professor Rossi, that's it. That is it. Thank you. You don't need 400 pages for that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think we are all on the same page regarding to this, at least in this small group of people. Let me, before we close, let me thank all of those who are following us in streaming, and let me also thank all of those who will follow us in a later moment, because this conversation will remain in IBL's YouTube and Facebook channels. Let me thank Daniel Gros, Daniel Lacaille, and Nicola Rossi, and Veronica Cancellieri, who has supervised this discussion. And let me remember that this is the first event we as IBL organized about the Draghi report, but we plan to have further discussions and further analysis of the proposals contained in the Draghi report, especially if and when they will have a follow-up at the institutional level. And finally, to close and describe this sort of roundtable, I would say that the German, Spanish, and an Italian discussed increasing public spending. They mostly agreed upon it, and this is not a joke, which is not bad. Thank you very much. Thanks to everybody, and see you next time.
Thank you
so much. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.